Do I think that the SNP are going to be losing seats by margins of 31% at the next general election? I have to say I don't think so. I think that very much has a sort of exaggerated by-election level swing.
There are some by-elections that pass almost uncommented upon, and there's some that tend to be bellwethers. This one feels like a big one.
It's definitely a big one, that's for sure. I would possibly caution against describing it as a bellwether, just in terms of this is a seat that in 3 previous elections that the SNP have won nationally, Labour have won this seat or its Holyrood equivalent. So it's not quite a bellwether in terms of swinging between parties, but just the scale of the Labour victory in this, which Anna Sarwar himself saying was even far beyond what we would expect Labour themselves were expecting to see, really marks us out as really one of the big ones.
Indeed, and he was pretty honest there. He said, look, we thought we'd won it. We're pretty sure we'd won it. We didn't think we were going to romp it like this.
Yeah, I mean, 31%. I mean, I do predictions for elections in terms of saying who I think may win. I don't do predictions in terms of how much I think they'll win by. So I didn't write this down. But frankly, I was operating on do you know what? It might be within the region of 10 to 15%. And obviously that's the margin here is twice as big as that. So yeah, it's been phenomenally, staggeringly huge. And I don't think anyone was expecting that was going to be what we would see coming out of this by-election.
Now, I have been as guilty as this as anyone, and generally believe it as well by saying you cannot extrapolate a national picture from 1 or even 2 or 3 by-elections, because by-elections are by nature their own beast, and there's certain things that bubble up at the time at which they happen. It's almost politics writ large, if you like. They become sort of bigger than a microcosm. But there are a lot of seats across Scotland where the SNP is in first and Labour is in second. And surely the SNP leadership are now looking over their shoulder in those seats.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's an interesting sort of nuance here where we've got sort of people perhaps on the SNP side of things who are perhaps wanting to view this through the lens of, by-elections are exceptional circumstances, they're exaggerated. And then there's the argument, which is this is a massive stonking win for Labour that really shows that, the SNP are in trouble. And that's the argument that perhaps is more favourable for, Labour. You hear Labour and other people supportive of the union making that argument. Both of them are kind of true in the sense that, do I think that the SNP are going to be losing seats by margins of 31% at the next general election? I have to say I don't think so. I think that very much has a sort of exaggerated by-election level swing. And if that did happen, just the seats that Labour are second in, never mind the seats that they're a close third, that would tip 26 seats if it was a similar 20% swing. But the other side is that is such a big swing that we can be reasonably certain there are going to be big swings overall. And even if the swing was, say, 10%, half as big, that would still tip 16 seats from the SNP to Labour on a sort of uniform basis. So there's a lot of seats are likely to flip here. And I'm definitely the point of saying...
And also where the SNP ends up putting in resource, because there will be some seats that they just can't afford to resource because they're shoring up ones that are more marginal.
Yes, I mean, certainly there might be ones where it's always a case of resource. You have to think carefully where you're spending. And the SNP have actually had the sort of odd luxury that no party have ever had before of not really having to target, because they've always been able to win everywhere since the referendum, because they've had that national spread in a way that the Conservatives and Labour and Lib Dems simply don't. That might then be a problem for them in any sort of election with the kind of tactical voting we might expect, people voting for the most likely non-SNP option in each constituency. That could make it very hard for them to determine which seats they have to put maximised resource into, because it could mean that most, if not all of their seats are at risk.
And the quirk here, Alan, is if you do extrapolate this into a national picture, and I'm not saying that you should, but despite the fact that both the Tories and Lib Dems lost their deposit here and had losses, they would actually go up by 1 seat each, because they're fighting again. They're second in seats where it's the SNP that hold it, and the SNP vote fell more than their vote did.
Exactly, yeah. And as we said earlier, you should be very cautious about extrapolating nationwide from these. We are not going to see these kinds of negative swings against the Conservatives in rural Scotland where Labour aren't competing. So they probably will hold on to more of their vote. But yeah, definitely, as I'm saying, the thing that we've sort of seen in Scotland over the past few elections is that kind of sorting into the SNP versus the locally strongest challenger. And that does potentially, in the current circumstances, benefit those challengers.